Good morning or good afternoon, depending on which part of Australia you happen to be or anywhere around the world. Welcome to RISB's latest webinar. We run a series of masterclass webinars throughout the year, and today we are looking at the track to decarbonised rolling stock. Before we get any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet today. For me, I'm in Perth, so that's the Wudjak Noongar people, and I wish to pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. Now, today I'm very lucky to be joined by Paul Ferguson and Ulrich Schroeder from Jacobs. We're going to talk about a white paper that's been recently released around net zero and where standards sit within net zero. But before I start, I'll just quickly kick off. And for those who don't know Paul, and I think most people do, Paul's very proliferate in the industry. Paul is a chartered professional engineer with over 22 years experience in the industry, including international projects and multi-million-dollar scope deliveries. He specialises in providing solutions to client challenges and solving those really difficult project problems. I've worked with Paul on many very difficult projects, and we've had a really good time trying to nut out some of those ones. Paul's very passionate about rolling stock and lifting the rail industry as one, looking for those horizon issues that might hinder progress. Ulrich Schroeder, she's an associate rolling stock engineer at Jacobs. Ulrich has 8 years experience within the rail sector across Australia and also in Europe. Her background includes both engineering and project management expertise within major rail projects, and she's accumulated diverse experience in various roles across all stages of the rolling stock life cycle. Now, I'd just like to remind everyone that we do have a chat function, a QA option there. So if you've got any questions, please drop them into the chat or into the QA section, and we will get to those when we get to the end of this presentation. So overall, RISB is very, very mindful of where the industry is going in relation to net zero. Obviously, net zero is a key component of any transport policy nowadays, and we need to be on top of this. So RISB identified that we wanted to make sure that our standards do not provide any sort of roadblocks or barriers to the introduction of new technologies towards net zero. So in collaboration with Jacobs, the white paper that's going to be discussed today was developed, which highlights the areas which RISB standards can be improved to help industry bring in these new technologies so we can continue working towards this net zero. So with that said, I'd like to hand over to Paul and Ulrich, and we'll hear all about the report. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and welcome everyone to this RISB masterclass. We also got a QR code in the back of the presentation if you want to request a copy of the slides. As Chris mentioned, we are going to present on our research and review of rolling stock standards and the impact of the introduction of zero-emission technology. We reviewed 65 rolling stock standards and identified 30 standards that require updates as they don't fully accommodate zero-emission technology. In this presentation, we are going to present our review methodology and the key findings of this review, and we're going to finish up with some conclusions and recommendations for the industry. Why is this important? The transport sector.
Ulrika, can I just interrupt? Your audio is just breaking up.
Okay.
So I don't know if you want to switch to guns or switch to headphones, or move closer. Sorry.
That's better. So why is this important? The transport sector in Australia is responsible for about 21% of the total CO2 emissions, and rail transport is contributing about around 4%.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's fixed it. Ulrika, I might have to try something else. Just please bear with us. Thanks for your patience. Look at all these good suggestions coming in.
Not sure if that has fixed it now.
Just try talking again.
So the transport sector in Australia is responsible for about 21% of the total CO2 emissions, with rail transport contributing.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's any better. It's sort of picking up. It's surging kind of thing.
Well, Paul, are you able to talk
thing
to these slides?
You'd ask that, Chris.
And maybe if I turn off the camera, maybe that would help.
Yeah, try that, or you could try coming back in, as somebody suggested.
Just while we're waiting for Ulrika to sort out her issues that we all face too often, unfortunately, I'll just touch on the fact that RISB is it's trying to be very proactive in the whole net zero space. So aside from this particular work that we've done with Jacobs, we're also developing standards specifically around new technologies and net zero. So for example, recently we released AS 7486, which is around electrical onboard storage. So your battery storage, which we've released about a year ago. And soon to be released will be AS 7655, which is around the wayside electrical charging interface. So we are doing a lot of work in this space, and we're going to develop more standards in this space. And certainly the work here that Jacobs has done has pointed us towards some other areas that we feel standardisation could be really valuable. Now, see, Ulrika's back, so we'll see if we've got the volume sorted out now.
Yeah. So the transport sector in Australia is responsible for 21% of the total CO2 emissions, and the rail transport contributes around 4%. The Australian government has set out national emissions targets of 43% below 2005 levels, and net zero by 2050.
It still has issues. I might take it then, or yeah, as Mark said, try switching off your camera and talking.
These targets are especially relevant for Australia's freight fleet, as operators will face financial penalties if they don't meet these targets.
Yeah, that hasn't really helped it, Ulrika.
Okay, do you want to take over?
Not really, but I will. All right. Well, yeah, we haven't rehearsed this, so this is going to be interesting. Essentially, why did we look at this? Well, there's a lot of pressure around the industry to decarbonize, and there's some industry targets that we need to get to. One of the things, and Chris touched on it earlier, is that we need to move towards this as an industry, and we need to collectively remove potential blockers or slowdown points that will hinder progress. So this is one of them, like standards for adoption and standards for compliance and standards for performance was potentially one of those areas that could slow down adoption. Also, we can look at ways to accelerate, and we sort of touched on that in this white paper as well, sort of bringing in global standards so that people could use references from best practice overseas, while the standards in Australia have been progressing. This is the next slide, Ulrika. So in this part, we're just going to give a brief introduction. we're assuming that the majority of people who are on the call and who have attended this this webinar have a brief understanding or a general understanding about the different technologies that we've got coming into the industry. So we're not going to dive into them significantly here. There is a little bit more in the white paper that will give you a deeper level of understanding and context. So the first one is electrification. We see that this is probably the most established technology for reduction in emissions for rolling stock and rail operators. It's been around for over 100 years. There's a lot of design, there's a lot of input, and there's a very mature understanding around how it functions with rolling stock at the interface and as an operation. We're also seeing that with the influx of renewable energy and the integration of those power sources into the rail corridor, that we're seeing that the treatment and management of renewables getting much better. We've also seen that there's a lot more interest in wayside storage to help level demand, to stop surges in various demands from the rolling stock, to sort of port it into a wayside storage and then take it off that, rather than having infrastructure trying to capitalize and use that incoming demand. And RISB will soon be launching a new set of standards around the 25 kV systems, and that'll help consolidate a lot of the different network-specific standards and requirements around the country. So we're seeing a lot more being done in this space, but it really is the go-to renewable energy source for rolling stock. The next one is batteries. So complementing the overhead wire electrification, we're seeing further adoption for batteries on rolling stock. As Chris mentioned, there's a standard that's been out for a number of years now that talks about onboard energy storage. And what we're seeing is this capacity and the investment into the technology is increasing, such that you don't need to electrify your network completely, that you can focus on islands and reduce the infrastructure costs using battery technology to bridge those islands. In Australia, we're seeing a lot more growth in this area, a lot more adoption, a lot more projects being launched. We've seen, and Chris was there a couple of weeks ago down in Adelaide, and the DMUs there integrating ABB technology to complement the diesel power pack. Pretty common around the world is batteries and supercapacitors in light rail vehicles. In fact, we've got a number of those in operation in Australia as well. And we're seeing a few large projects being launched and coming to fruition in the Pilbara, with the first Wabtec battery loco due in Australia early next year via Roy Hill. There's also orders with BHP, Fortescue, and Rio Tinto as well. You would have seen Roger Buckley doing the rounds. Horizon have a very well advanced decarbonisation journey underway. They've got a number of projects that are chipping away in the background, and they're often seen as the leader in railway and rolling stock decarbonisation, particularly in the freight space. We know that there are other operators that are researching the technology and looking to launch projects very soon. Next one, Ulrika, please. Hydrogen fuel cells. Look, these took off with the industry consciousness a number of years ago, creating a bit of a hunger and thirst for knowledge and obviously an education source for the industry. We know that Alstom have been quite proactive in this area. In fact, getting a fleet of hydrogen-powered trains up and running in Germany. But we now know that some operators are favouring battery technology and electrification over hydrogen fuel. So there's currently no hydrogen fuel trains in operation in Australia. If I'm wrong, you can shoot me a Q&A later and help educate me. But predominantly, we see that the technology is emerging, it is growing, but there are other options that people are favouring ahead of it. Next one, Ulrika, please. A couple of the other aspects that we touched on is the use of ammonia and the use of biofuels. They're probably not as prevalent as electrification, batteries, and discussion around hydrogen, but they are emerging technologies. We know that Victoria are researching and investigating quite a bit into biofuels, and we know that some of the mining companies are also looking at ammonia as a carrier for hydrogen. There's a lot of investigation, a lot of development, but we're not seeing deep market penetration with these technologies. Nonetheless, in the white paper, we did review all the standards in consideration of these. So we don't have to go back and visit that when the technology emerges proper. Next one, Ulrika. So if you've read the white paper already, thank you very much. So I'm just going to go over the review methodology. Essentially, we reviewed all of the RISB products, and we decided to focus on the rolling stock-based products because that was where we were seeing the biggest move and the greatest urgency in adoption of zero emission technology. So we decided to take all the products, and we selected around 75 initial standards, guidelines, and codes of practice. And then we discussed those with RISB and narrowed down the final batch to around 65 products. Then each of the products were then split up into different disciplines, and within the Jacobs rolling stock team, they were distributed out to the SMEs, who then undertook the review. And then from that review, we consolidated the gaps that were identified, conducted peer reviews for that, researched international standards, and then we prioritized the standards in an order of criticality, urgency, and scale of change. Just go to the next one, Ulrika. So in the process of developing the white paper, we did have to make a number of assumptions. This was so that the paper was bounded properly, and that we kept focus on the objectives we're trying to achieve. The introduction to the different technologies was provided just to give context only. You could easily go off and do a state of the industry and do a deep dive into each of the technologies, but we decided that we wanted to focus on the standards more. So we just included those to give context to the reader. As mentioned, we did look at the rolling stock standards primarily. As I said, that's where we're seeing the majority of the change. The standards that we found from international reviews were only provided as guidance. We did not do a clause by clause to find out, mapping between gaps in the Australian standards and, the corresponding, fixing clause in the international ones. So this provided as a guidance, and it's really up to the stakeholder or the operator or reader to make that determination themselves. The effectivity, suitability, and applicability of each of these standards really needs to be determined by the adopters. It's not meant to be a rule. It's more to provide some evidence and informed position of where to look. And that goes also with the implementation of any of the technology. It's down to the stakeholders to do that determination, not the purpose of the white paper. We looked at the gaps in the standards around zero emission technology. We didn't look at the rest of the standard to see whether there were other aspects missing. We didn't look at changes in legislation for something else, or we didn't look at how road traffic is managed and that kind of stuff. We focused on gaps in zero emission technology as opposed to the remaining content of the standard. We did look at it in a complete rolling stock context, so passenger, trains, freight, truck machines. So it was a complete spectrum review. Next one, Ulrika. I'll just go quickly through this because we've lost a bit of time with the audio. So the selection factors that we applied when we were determining which standards to look at, primarily related to rolling stock. We also scaled the level of effort that we would apply to each standard. If you can imagine that the wheels standard, the bearing standard, they're not going to have a lot of impact or consideration under zero emission technology. So they were given like a smaller amount of time and effort to review rather than the amount of time that we would look at for, say, the fire standard. We also looked at the ability for that standard to influence safety and also the efficiency of rolling stock operations. So from that, we had a categorized list of standards that then we distributed to our internal team. Next one, Ulrika. So fundamentally, when we were looking at the standards, each of the engineers was asked, is there a potential impact for gaps, impact due to gaps in zero emission technology? How old is the standard? And does the standard cater for today's railways in a technology perspective? And then for the engineer to explain, what's the nature of the gap? Like, is it like a human factors or a behavioral one? Is it a safety management? Is it a functional performance? Describe and detail what it is. So from there, we also had a peer review for each of the standards to make sure that we applied the right level of due diligence. And then we also dive down a little bit further with a more detailed, more explicit explanation of what was missing. So from the 65, we found that just under half had a potential impact, and obviously the remaining 35, there was no impact. For example, the wheels standard had no impact. Next one, Ulrika. So once we had identified the standards that had the issues, we set about prioritizing them, and the main driver for this was to illustrate to RISB, the level of importance to address those gaps and to influence their work plan for coming years. That way, for instance, say there was a gap in the fire standard, that was, not overlooked or put down the list in favor of something related to signals around temperature coming into the driver's cab. So we set a priority ranking. The factors we used were the age of the standard, the urgency, like how important is this for the industry to have the standard in place now, the scale of the change, and also the safety criticality of the system that is affected. And from those factors, we applied extra weighting to the urgency so that RISB could prioritize those above standards that were maybe 6-7 years old. It would provide a greater weighting to bring them up the list. And then also the safety criticality of them. We placed extra importance on that. Next one, Ulrika. From the industry standard, so we've got our global principal for vehicle engineering on the call. So he heads up, his name's Gavin Fraser, he heads up a code of community of practice of over 200 rolling stock engineers spread around the world. So we tapped into that list, covering most of the rail and rolling stock markets, and sought opinions and feedback on standards that they'd seen change in their local regions. We also sought information from projects that have been delivered based on Jacob's experience. This next slide, Ulrika, please. So key findings. So if you've not seen the white paper, these are the top 8 standards that we identified that needed urgent review. So if you're good at maths and you can understand the ranking score, the top possible ranking that you can get is 30, and we found that the fire standard came out with a ranking of 29 out of 30, putting it right up at the top of the priority list for RISB. The second group of standards that we found was lacking or had the biggest gaps was around the body structural requirements, followed by rail emergency planning, and mildly surprisingly, event recorders. So those are the top 8 standards out of the 30. The white paper goes into the rest of them in a bit more detail. So this next couple of sections, we're just going to go into some of the reasoning behind why each of these standards featured so highly. And that for the fire one, look, the standard is 10 years old, so that had already fallen outside the standard RISB review cycle of around 7 years. Because of the age and because of the rapid change in technology, that standard only focuses on like traditional fires and doesn't include any consideration for lithium, hydrogen, or ammonia events. We found that some of the measurement criteria can be improved across all the modes and different events. We felt that suppression and detection technologies, they've moved on from where they were and where they're described in the standard. So we felt that special treatment of the lithium, hydrogen, and ammonium fires, the suppression for those events can be better documented. And we'd also like to see more guidance on strategies related to thermal runaway, gaseous pooling and venting, which are associated with these technologies. Another aspect that we saw was missing was related primarily around lithium-ion batteries and the safe storage of those with the conditions related to them as well. You're probably familiar with a lot of the sort of factory fire events that are happening with lithium-ion batteries in the media. If you can imagine, we're looking to put 50 tons of batteries per locomotive into storage for the Pilbara fleets. You can imagine that that's a significant amount of lithium-ion cells and battery packs. So we think that either a new standard needs to be developed for that related to rolling stock, or we see that it needs to be amalgamated into this standard. And also around the alarms, alerts, and monitoring related to lithium-ion batteries. Next one, Ulrika, please. Either we're full of mechanical and structural engineers in our team, or there is something really that needs to be done here. We found that the primary concern was that there just wasn't enough discussion around protection for lithium-ion batteries, fuel cells, fuel tanks, reservoir pipes, and the systems associated with zero-emission technologies. We know that there are dangerous goods standards related to the transport of dangerous goods by railway, but those are in a larger tank environment, and we recommend that they're applied in more of a structural, passenger inclusive environment. Performance of collision performance, protection and shock loading need to be updated to accommodate these types of vehicles. So next one, Ulrika. Not surprisingly, the rail emergency planning guideline we identified needed some review. That guideline defines the roles of organisations during the coordination of response to rail emergencies. So we felt that it was lacking details and requirements related to zero-emission technology emergency management. We recommend that there's a bit more inclusion of notifications. So if you're running a certain route or timetable or path, and you're using these new technologies, that you notify all of the emergency response stakeholders along that route. Perhaps providing additional training, requirements for specialist team support who are trained in dealing with those kind of events, and also information packs shared to stakeholders. We also recommend updates to the wording around spills and potential fires related to batteries and hydrogen, and that they should be treated appropriately. Next one, Ulrika. And I think this rounds out the sort of the top 4 or the top 8 that have been combined. Rolling stock event recorders. There are mandatory requirements related to signals that are monitored. And what we've seen is that system performance related to zero emission technology and system health aren't included in those. I know the event recorder is predominantly like a post-event device, but the behavior of systems and the health of the zero emission technology systems should be included in these recordings to determine, causal factors to incidents. That aside, incidents aside, it can also be used to determine degradation of performance and maybe early warning of system flaws and issues. Next one, Ulrika, please. So what did we learn? There are gaps in a number of the rail products that are within the industry. We felt that mainly it was because of the rapid development and deployment of the technology that's kind of happened inside of the product review cycles. most of the products that we actually looked at had very little impact because of the new technologies. But as a result of there being these gaps, and when sort of industry users, when they go to look to standards for the answers to some of the requirements, because there's nothing there, we're in danger of having a behavior where standards are being bypassed because they aren't perceived as being applicable to, you know, emerging technology and you know, business requirements. So that, you know, that's something that I'm sure that we all want to fix, particularly RISB, and we'd like to rely on our standards to provide ongoing guidance. Globally, there seems to be a lot more products overseas that a lot of the countries are moving faster than our region. So we're recommending that there's a lot more collaboration, one between like intercompany and also between the standards governing bodies to bring through a little bit more collaboration and learning around these kind of technology gaps. And that, you know, there's a great opportunity for us as a region to learn from some of these more progressive countries. Like, how are they getting these standards through much faster? How are they being more agile as technology evolves? You know, what can we do to adopt the same principles? Around delivery, we've seen that stakeholders are really filling in their own requirements and filling in the gaps themselves. Because there's a demand there to go to market and deliver products and deliver solutions, we find that they're filling their own requirements. What that can mean is that critical aspects of asset performance and integration are not being found out until later on in the process. So because they've filled in their own requirements, that they may not have been through a full cycle of review and consultation and determination, and that it's creating risks further down the delivery cycle. We've also seen that a lot of information is being protected to retain a competitive edge rather than a shared industry benefit. Next one, Ulrika, please. So recommendations, maybe there's a couple of extra ones in here, Chris, just to surprise you. So we recommend that RISB does a review and update their hazard register. That's the register that all of the standards are put in place to mitigate, if you're not familiar with that. That the prioritized standards are integrated into the RISB work plan. Perhaps mobilization of DG members, standards development manager, and the author early to ensure that you know, we're doing things in parallel rather than in serial. I'd like to see a survey for the industry to understand where their standards and requirement needs are, where they are now in relation to technology and where they might be in the future. RISB does offer that consultation and information service, but I'd like to see a bit more, maybe a bit more vocal about that, that process. It'd be good to see contact points so that if companies and businesses come to RISB with information around gaps, that there's a contact point, perhaps in another standards authority overseas, to help them understand solutions to those issues. I'd recommend that for these master classes that perhaps we bring in some global standards authorities to talk about how they've overcome some of the challenges and where they see risks and opportunities around new technology. And we're recommending also that the standards not related to rolling stock, that they're also undertaken as a review for gaps in zero emission technology. Next one, Ulrika. Oh, that's it. Fantastic. So if you just leave that slide up, Ulrika, there's a QR code there. It takes right to my Instagram page. So like, subscribe, and follow. No, it takes you to an MS form where you can enter your details. We'll send you a copy of the slides if you want. And we're also available to talk further about the white paper or any other topics you would like. Except horses. I don't do horses. Chris, that's the end of that monologue.
No, well done, Paul, and thank you for jumping in at the last minute, mate. Really appreciate it. Yeah, and a really good white paper. I strongly advise or recommend that people have a look at that paper. There's some fantastic information amongst that. RISB has already taken on some of those recommendations that Paul's put forward. So, for example, AS 7529, the fire safety standards. You'll be seeing a call for development groups coming out in the near future. Also for 7527 event recorders, and we're already doing work on the body structural standards as well. So there's lots going on in that space, but we've got quite a few questions. So I'm going to start going through some of these. The first one was around for you, Paul. What international standards already exist for fires and lithium-ion battery technology in a rail application? In your research, did you come across any?
We did, and unfortunately, I'm not a Rain Man. I can't just flip out standards numbers like you can, Chris. But there are standards related to it. There are some standards around storage as well. Look, there's not a lot out there, but we are seeing that standards agencies are starting to deploy that content. If you scan the QR code and send that question to me separately, I'll get that number for you.
Right, thank
same
you very
with
much.
any of the questions. If we don't get to answer them, just scan that, shoot it in. Oh, look, we've got a Rain Man online, they've said.
Yeah, so there's one there from Gareth. Thank you very much, Gareth. Another question, when you were doing this work, did you consider life cycle right through to the end, so disposal of these technologies? Was that sort of considered in the white paper?
I'd have to read it again. I know it's an important topic. There's no standards that cover that and how to look at that. The QR code doesn't work. Sorry about that, people. Send me an email at that address then. Sorry about that. There's no standards that apply to disposal. We did consider it, but we didn't have too many recommendations around it. It is something that is important. It does need to be addressed, because soon, like in 5 to 6 years, we will have a wave of batteries where the performance X related to the asset, and they can be repurposed somehow. So we need to know how to do that.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be a challenge, and I think it's a challenge for any of these new technologies as they evolve. What are we going to do once they become life expired? And I think that's a question that not a lot of people have answers to yet. So that's certainly an ongoing challenge. There's another question here. You noted that the body structural for passenger and freight vehicles was in the priority list, but not locomotives. Was that considered or not considered a priority?
It was definitely considered. Ulrika, do you know why that was the case, or have we missed out a number there somewhere?
No, that was something with the prioritization. I have to look it up in the white paper, but it was definitely something around the might be volume or urgency of change.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean that it was considered because that's where we're seeing the start of, we've reviewed the Wabtec loco in relation to structural requirements for their lithium-ion batteries, and there does need to be more work in that space, particularly those 40, 50 tons of batteries in a locomotive asset. So if you send me an email, or maybe we can get these questions at the end, we'll respond to that.
Yep, certainly. Another question I've got here, could you elaborate on the specific challenges that you think the rail industry is facing around adopting these net emission technologies and the role that standards could play in that space?
That's a super cool question. Who asked that?
A super cool person.
Oh, sweet. So standards is just one aspect that can slow down adoption, primarily because, and we're seeing this with people who are authorizing or approving the introduction of these technologies. Quite often they're not as informed as people who are living day to day and sort of the engineering side of stuff around these technologies. So we see that if there are standards and you can point to compliance of that standard for that technology, there's a lot more assurance, as in people feel more comfortable that you've got it under control. Because you're following a defined standard. So the standards give, because of the way standards are perceived in the industry, the standards can provide more assurance that you're following the right process and that you're compliant, and the risk is minimized. So I see that's a big role for the standards. But there are other aspects related to, safety assurance that perhaps aren't covered completely in standards. Maybe they're touched on with EN 50126. But, if you've got a specific engineering standard that you can state, we're complying with this, it makes that acceptance of that asset a lot easier.
Yeah, but it's certainly a challenge too from a standards point of view, that as this technology constantly evolves, keeping the standards open enough that they allow the technology to evolve and improve, so we don't inhibit that, but also provide enough direction that you get a level of harmonisation, standardisation and safety all in one is a challenge. A question here, and you may not be able to answer this one, but during their research, did Jacobs consider any of the IEC standards, in particular 63341 hydrogen fuel cells?
I see my good friend Roy Laurie wrote that. So we focused on the review of Australian standards, particularly the RISB products. We looked at that standard, but whether we've made it into the recommendations or the supplementary standards, I can't remember. But yeah, the focus was on reviewing gaps in the Australian standards, not globally, and it wasn't a coverall sort of nomination of international standards.
No, that's fine, mate. I'll do one more question. So this is actually, as a member of the Below Rail team, I'm curious about how decarbonisation efforts might impact track engineering. Are there any developments in track engineering related to decarbonisation, or is it primarily focused on locomotives?
Look, I think locomotives, there will be a difference, but I see it mostly related to mass distribution. For locomotives, as you know, you've got, quite often like large fuel tanks, like 10,000 litre, 12,000 litre fuel tanks down low. With the new technologies, that's being swapped out for like control components and electronics, and your mass is being lifted higher up into the rolling stock. So you've got, like I keep going back to the 200-ton locos, you got 50 tons of mass that's kind of been lifted up. So your CFG is a lot higher in the vehicle. So whilst it should be catered for within your dynamic kinematic outline, you may, and it will still have to comply with track force limits. I could see that having something that needs to be monitored, the more get introduced, to see if that does have a detrimental effect. So from a track perspective, probably around that. If you're looking at sort of 25 kV electrification, you also might have like different switching frequencies and different EMC requirements. So that is something that also we could see an influx of either compliance or issues related to, the change away from diesel infrastructure, a diesel architecture into an electronic architecture. So not as significant, and hence why we focused on where the big change is happening, which is around rolling stock on board as opposed to infrastructure impacts.
No, thanks, Paul. All right. Well, we've still got quite a few questions, but we'll take note of these and try and get them through to Paul, and also have a look at it ourselves and see if we can get back to all these people. So thank you very much for all the questions. I'd like to thank both Paul and Ulrich for their time today, and the work that they've done on this paper. It's very, very valuable. It's already informing a lot of the work that we are going to do over the coming years. So thanks again for everything that they've done in this space. I'd just like to, at this point, just remind everyone that our next masterclass webinar will be held on Tuesday, the 26th of November. Dr. Michelle Zebots from the University of Technology in Sydney will be presenting on the topic of Countdown to the Inevitable: Resource Scarcity, Decarbonisation, and the Electrification of Rail Freight in Australia. So keep your eyes open for that one, and I hope you can all join us then. Until then, have a great day, and thank you very much for your time.